So now to go back to chapter 3, who are these guys? I don't know, but I'm going to take a wild guess that if you and I were hanging out there, we probably would have been scared out of our wits. So what are these? They're heavenly creatures that guard holiness. They guard the presence of the deity. And since the deity is evidently still residing in Eden, whatever that means, we have no access to it. Now, I know what you're going to ask. What happened to it? Where was it?
Hey everybody, welcome back to yet another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I am one of the hosts, Keegan Walls, the layman, with 31 years of experience being such. And joining me today, and always, Mark Chavalas, the man, the myth, the legend. Dr. Mark Chavalas, how are you?
I'm just fine, thank you.
Awesome. Well, it's been a little while since we're back in studio, so excited to be wrapping up Genesis. We are going to be talking about the last chunk of Genesis 3 before we move on to something else. And so, looking forward to today's conversation, see where it goes, see if we have some wrap-up questions. So
yeah, that would be good.
Finally wrap up Genesis and move on to some other fun, exciting topics, I'm sure.
Maybe also in Genesis. We'll see.
We'll see where we land. So, like I said, we are going to be wrapping up Genesis 3 today. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is what we've been going through, kind of the creation account, the foundation to, obviously, the Bible, but just to the work that Mark is doing, and again, kind of even more so than the Ancient Near Eastern series we did, right, to start it off, giving you guys a context to be able to figure out and learn the lens in which Mark is going to be approaching the Bible, which is, how should I understand this in its original context, in its original culture, and how would the ancient people have understood the original texts? And so we are going to jump into Genesis 3, 21. And so I'll pass it, right?
Well, 20, I think we can start with 20.
Well, there you go. We're on a roll. Genesis 3, 20. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, Genesis 3:20 through 24 seems to be a unit, and I suppose you could make the argument that since it's a start of a narrative and we just had the poetic penalties or curses on ground and on serpents, it might even be a different section. But I'm not going to quibble with the chapter and verse divider person, so I'm going to assume it's part of this unit. And in some respects it is, I suppose. When does Adam do this in verse 20? It's not necessarily sequentially after the problem that occurred, by the way, and we sort of assume it's that way, but let's just move on with this. Verse 20, as you know, it's interesting that he's not called Adam here. He's now back to being called the man. Of course, it's the same word, but there's a definite article in front of it. So now the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. So what's the significance of this? Because it looks sort of random, I think, to a 21st century person. It perhaps is being put there, first of all, because the man is now reasserting his position as in terms of leadership. Of course, this is all subjective and it's all subtle from that standpoint. But of course, remember, what was the first thing that God said to Adam after the event occurred? And the penalty in verse 17, because you listened to the voice of your wife. And at that point, my comment is because you put yourself now in a subordinate position to her. Some commentators have argued this is a reassertion by naming something. When you name something, of course, you have some sort of power over it. Parents name children. This, of course, the same thing can happen. For example, if you know someone's name or secret name, that also might be significant. And so, for example, when Jacob is wrestling with an angel, 20-some more chapters later on, he'll ask his name, and we end up finding out it's God. And he says, "Why do you ask?" And you're thinking, well, what's the retort? And there is no retort. Like, okay, that end of discussion. And so, and for example, Samson's parents ask about the angel, and they, it's almost as, to paraphrase, mom says, well, I didn't catch his name, and I was sort of afraid to ask. But anyway, so I'm guessing this is a subtle way of showing that he's reasserting his positional authority over Eve. And by the way, this, of course, is implied, and maybe Rabbi Paul will conclude the same thing, a couple thousand years later in this. But that's all we're told. And of course, now we're also having this teleology. This is why she's called Eve, which presumably means something from the verb to live, and so she's now the mother of all who live. What was she before? Woman. Now she's called the begatter, or the one who brings forth life. And then we're not told anything after that. And so again, there's a whole lot more that meets the eye here. The ancient Near Eastern listener has a much better context for us than we do. Have I ever said that before? Probably once or twice or 300 times. And then 21, the Lord God, so Yahweh Elohim, made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Typically, these are types of garments that are mentioned anywhere, usually skin. Of course, people have made a big deal about the fact that if this is skin, that means animals had to be killed for this to happen. I'm not sure that this is as significant as people have made it, but the fact that God is doing it probably is God extending some type of mercy towards them. But other than that, I'm in the dark as to why exactly God would be doing this type of thing, and its significance at that point. What is more interesting to me is then we get to 22, God now seems to be deliberating with what I had called in 126 his divine counsel. And if I have to be consistent here, I have to assume it's the same thing, but the wording's a little different. Behold, the man, God is now talking. Behold, the man has become like one of us. Okay, who's the us? Knowing good and evil. Here, if this is what I said it was earlier in the chapter concerning a moral agency, and so it's moral autonomy, who's God talking to? Do the angels have moral autonomy? Well, I suppose they do, in the sense is we're well aware that angels have the ability to choose their own morality. And of course, if the serpent is in that category, this has already happened. And so I don't think this is a problem if you think that this is a divine counsel. Again, does this negate the Trinity? Not at all. I just don't think that that's what's being issued here any more than I thought at the beginning in the first chapter, that though I'm convinced that God created everything out of nothing, I do not think that was the point of the chapter. So here, though the Trinity might be involved in this, I don't think it's the point of the passage. Okay. I expect some comments about that, and I'll be happy to respond in my snarky way. All right. In any event, and he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Well, that's sort of interesting. In Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh hears about a plant of life, and he doesn't have access to it because everyone knows you don't have access to it. Adapa, who I talked about before, was unable to partake of the bread of life that would give him life. And so the same thing is happening here, is we need now to block Adam and his kin, his family, from access to this other tree. And people have made tons about it, but I'm going to be consistent here and simply try to understand it from an ancient Near Eastern perspective and not go any further with it. I talked about the sacred tree in Mesopotamia that is shown iconographically, but not through literature. And so what's the connection here? I just don't know. However, God decides, and though there's a deliberation, it's God himself who decides to send him out from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. Okay, that's interesting. And so how does he do it? He drove the man out. And then we have to be told this, and of course some guy named Steinbach made a big deal about this. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. All right, so maybe we can try to unpack this passage a little bit. First of all, I mean, if I'm Adam, so I got kicked out of the east gate, well, maybe I'll just go around the other side. And it evidently doesn't have to be explained, but that may have been the only way to get in and out. I think it's almost sort of silly to speculate about that. Fun, as long as I don't take my answer very seriously. So they have to leave by that gate. And of course, Steinbach, who really knew his Bible well, by the way, was convinced that would be a good title for a book, East of Eden. I think it was made into a movie also, if I remember. But so how do I evaluate this in terms of geography? No, I don't. I'm just not even going to try. It's fascinating. I'm more interested in the cherubim, by the way, because the cherubim they're described in two ways in the Bible, as living beings and as non-living beings. In other words, there are representations of cherubim all over the place. Throughout the temple, there are cherubim. When God is on his footstool, or they are guarding the ark, they are guarding the temple, they're guarding God's throne. So maybe they're guarders. Okay, I don't know. They evidently don't need any introduction here, and they wouldn't have to anybody in the ancient Near East, by the way. They seem to be a group of heavenly beings. And by the way, I might have mentioned this before, but it's really true. We kind of lump all of the heavenly beings together and just call them angels. The word angels just mean messenger. So you and I could be an angel, but we would be earthly messengers and not heavenly messengers. And so that's why, for example, in Genesis 19, when Lot's hanging out at a city gate at Sodom, he saw two men come up. Why didn't he call them angels? Well, because he didn't know who they were, because they probably just like regular guys, probably just like you and me, or maybe just you. I don't know. So the point is that angelic beings may be as diverse or more diverse than human beings. For all we know, we're just not let in on this particular part of it because I suppose it's not a need to know issue. So why does he station cherubim there? They're guarders. Now the word cherubim, by the way, it's I suppose more technically cherubim, but in any event, who are they? First, maybe I'll start off with what they are in Mesopotamia, because of course this does have another Mesopotamian parallel. And so I got out my handy dandy Chicago Assyrian dictionary, which is finally finished, which is the dictionary for basically Mesopotamian Akkadian studies. That's the primary language, which I talked about in some previous episodes. And in the K volume, which is on page 216 and 217, and here it is right here, just to let you know. I culled it out, so it's also online, by the way, which was really cool. I wish it would have been online when I was a student. I wish anything would have been online when I was a student, but in fact, they hadn't even made clay tablets yet when I was a student. But anyway, so there is a being called a Cherubim. It's probably the trilateral root KRB has something to do with either pray or worship, but their function seems to be different. And these Cherubim sometimes are human and sometimes they're not human, which of course is a brilliant way of figuring it out. That'd be like saying, which a student did for me one time when I asked them on an exam, discuss the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire. And one student, his first statement was, the Roman Empire fell because of external and internal consequences. And I thought, that's brilliant. I wonder what other kinds are there? I mean, like extraterrestrial, or what else? Because they didn't elaborate on it. And the same thing here is that a Cherubim, here it says a person performing specific religious act, and so it could be a human being who. And by the way, if you are Cherubim, it looks as if you could be a person who's praying on behalf of someone else. And so, if let's say you're the king and I'm your daughter, and you just sent me to be an Aditu priestess, which is kind of like a nun, except when it's not like a nun. But you would basically, my vocation was not to get married, but to go, and I'd be in constant prayer for the royal family, and that was my job. Well, in a sense, I'm a Cherubim for the royal family. I'm praying, I'm invoking you, I'm supplicating, I'm doing all those things. That was one of the topics. That, by the way, that particular position doesn't appear to be in the Hebrew Bible at all from this standpoint. But the reason I'm using Mesopotamia is the reason I use it everywhere else, because here's our bigger context for all this. They're using vocabulary and social paraphernalia that would be understandable. So it also, by the way, designates a female worshiper. That would be a Cherubim. And so, in other words, there's a feminine to it in the same way, for example, you had scribes in Mesopotamia. Once in a while, you actually found a female scribe, which is pretty cool. How did they get to be one? We're never told. So for example, here's a daughter who says, I'm the only one who prays for you, and I'm not provided for, and I'm a Cherubim. It's also describing a deity, usually a deity that is making some sort of gesture. And by the way, if I want to show you that I'm subordinate to you or that you're important, I'll bend my knee and touch my nose, and this is an act of subordination. In the same way, for example, even in Islam, when you go pray, it's incumbent upon you to make sure that you bow and make sure that your nose touches the ground. We had some workers who would go off and pray, and they wanted to look pious, and so I could see them goofing off and then taking some dust and putting it on their nose as they came back. And I said, wow. So a deity can do this. Sometimes they're represented iconographically, but not very often, and they're not always called by this name, and so we're not always sure. And they're usually, and the divine determinative is put before the name, but it doesn't look like a personal name. It just means that this is one of these creatures. Are they ever garters? Yes. But other than that, they don't appear to be identical, but I think in terms of etymology, they're identical. So before I move on, I did bring a couple books. This one is a show and tell, happens to be Otmar Kiel's The Symbolism of the Biblical World. Really cool book, by the way. The subtitle, Ancient Near Eastern Iconography in the Book of Psalms, but he goes much further for it. And in this edition, I think I have it's the first edition, by the way, and so because I think there's been a second edition. So this is 1985 edition. On page 169, there's a description of kings sitting on thrones, and next to them are worshiper beings. A couple of them are from Neo-Hittite Anatolia, or southeastern Anatolia, and Syria. So this would be early first millennium, after, let's say, 1000 to about 700 BC. And these beings So in other words, they're sitting on a throne. This is pretty much what God is doing when he's sitting on a throne, although, of course, he's never depicted this way because you're never supposed to depict God as a created entity. And so a little bit further down in the Neo-Assyrian period, we also have royalty sitting on beings, and they look like what you might call in later periods griffins or sphinxes. And so even in ancient Egypt, there has been a connection. W.F. Albright made this connection over 100 years ago that sphinxes and cherubim seem to be alike. I don't know if that's the case. This actually happens to be, the king of Megiddo, not Assyrian. And King Ahiram of Byblos, which is also first millennium right-hand column, is also doing this. I don't know if you'll be able to see these well, but we'll go on to it. So iconographically, that's what they look like. When you get to the Bible, like I said, the cherubim, whatever they are, if they're in the presence of God all the time, they must be pretty impressive. We also read about them at the very end of in the last book in Revelation chapter 4, and maybe I'll go to there for just a minute to try and figure some of this stuff out. And by the way, I love putting puzzles together as long as I look at it this way. When I try to put biblical puzzles together or Mesopotamian puzzles, I'll put them together, and then I found out I'm still missing 10 pieces. And so I still don't know exactly what this thing is, but I know more than I did yesterday about it. So even this, here we are in heaven, in God's throne, which of course would be a temple. Here's a scene in heaven in Revelation chapter 4. And around the throne, verse 4, there were 24 thrones. Upon the thrones I saw 24 elders. Do we really know who these are? They must be heavenly beings. And on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white garments. And from the throne came flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, 7 lamps, etc. And then verse 7, the first creature was like a lion, second creature like a calf, the third creature had the face of a man, the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And this all this seems to be like the cherubim. Then you go back to Ezekiel, and of course Revelation has so many connections to the book of Ezekiel. In fact, you shouldn't be studying Revelation if you haven't already gone through Ezekiel, which of course is probably going to blow your head gasket. But in Ezekiel chapter 10, when God is leaving the temple, because of course that's when he's, in other words, God cannot possibly be there when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys the temple. So there has to be a leaving, and that's the Ikavo, the poor guy's name, Ichabod. That means there is no glory. He's gone. And so in chapter 10, Ezekiel's having this vision. Poor guy. I mean, this is just frightening. In verse 2, he spoke to the man clothed in linen and said, enter between the whirling wheels under the cherubim and fill your hands with coals of fire between the cherubim and scatter them over the city. And he entered in my sight. I guess they knew who the cherubim were because, I'm going to guess that whatever the cherubim are, there's probably a lot of different shapes and sizes to them, and it might not all be one type of being because sometimes they seem to have 2 feet, sometimes they seem to have 4. Never 3 though. So, and it says, verse 3, now the cherubim were standing on the right side of the temple when the man entered, and the cloud filled the inner court. And then God's glory went up from the cherubim to the threshold of the temple, and the temple was filled with a cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of God. And you keep on going a little bit further. For example, verse 9, and maybe you know the old spiritual Ezekiel saw the wheel, which I had to sing in I remember in a high school glee club. We had made all sorts of funny lines for it, and we got in trouble for it. So this is biting it. It's coming back to haunt me now, almost 55 years later now. But anyway.
You don't want to perform that?
No performance, no. They decided that it was not in our best interest or anybody else's. So, but it's interesting. Verse 8, the cherubim appeared to have the form of a man's hand under the wings. Then I looked, and behold, 4 wheels beside the cherubim, 1 wheel beside each cherub. And the appearance of the wheels was like the gleam of a Tarshish stone, which would be really bright, evidently. And as for their appearance, all 4 of them had the same likeness, as if one wheel were within another wheel. Well, thanks, Ezekiel. That makes perfect sense. When they moved, they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went, but they followed in the direction which they faced without turning as they went. Their whole body, their backs, their hands, their wings, and their wheels were full of eyes all around. I'm going to guess, take a wild guess, this is probably not talking about anatomy in great detail. This might even be metaphorical. Just like Revelation at the beginning, it talks about it being signs. But of course, we like to take everything literally. It makes us feel better. And the wheels were called, verse 13, were called in my hearing the whirling wheels. Okay, and each one had 4 faces. The first face was like that of a cherub. Ezekiel, I don't know what a cherub looks like. Could you tell me what a cherub looks like? Just you tell me it had the face of a cherub. And of course, the answer that Ezekiel would have given you is that what's a cherub like? How do you know it's a cherub? Ezekiel probably would have said something like, I know it's a cherub because of the way it is. I mean, like, don't you know? Because evidently, and okay, that's the whole point, Ezekiel. I'm talking to you 2,500 years later. I don't know what a cherub looks like. Second face was the face of a man. Third, the face of a lion. The fourth, the face of an eagle. But they're all cherubs. So what does it mean for one to have a face of a cherub and the other cherubs didn't have cherub faces? Okay, I'm confused. And then the cherubim rose up in verse 4. In summary, they're the living beings I saw by the river Kebar. And they moved, the wheels would go up beside them, and also when the cherubim lifted up their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels would not turn from beside them. And then they stood still, etc. And then verse 19, when the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings. Oh, they've got wings too. And rose up from the earth in my sight, with the wheels beside them, and they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house. And the glory of the Lord Israel hovered over them. And, in his summary in 20, these are the living beings that I saw beneath the God of Israel by the river Kebar. Of course, they're beneath him because they're the ones that uphold the glory. So I knew they were cherubim. In other words, since they were upholding the glory, that's how I knew they were cherubim. Well, thanks, Ezekiel. And then he continues on and says, he has a few more sentences for us. Now, the best Ezekiel commentary, if you're wondering, you say, hey, I got to go out and figure all this out, I think was written, the 2-volume commentary by Daniel Block. By the way, he did it in this series, the New International Commentary in the Old Testament. Daniel Block spent probably half of his life working on this commentary, so take him seriously. I did not read up on his commentary to see what he says about this, but I'm gonna take a wild guess that he's perplexed.
So let me stop you there. What in the ancient world? Because again, you said the East Gate. Is there like ancient Mesopotamian significance with it being the East Gate? Not that it can't just be the East Gate.
I'm sure there is. Mm-hmm. Yep, sure there is. I don't have no idea. And I don't even know what it is in the Bible, but there clearly is a significance. And anybody reading Ezekiel, if they forgot what they read in Genesis, is going to say, wait a minute, cherubim, east. Hey, that's intertextuality. No doubt about it, that when Ezekiel is doing that, he wants you to remember Genesis 3. And so in a seamless way, we can go back to Genesis 3 and say, oh, now I know all about the cherubim. Those are the living being cherubims, and of course actually cherubim is plural, but I still should put the S on it because that's what you do in English, by the way. That's how you make plurals usually, except for sheep and other things. But so now do I know all about the cherubim? No, I don't know all about the cherubim, and I'm more confused. The fact that there's a Mesopotamian antecedent isn't as helpful as I thought it would be, but of course as you're going to find out if we continue this over and over again, this is going to happen with everything we discuss.
Because what was the word, the Mesopotamian word?
Karibu.
And then how do we know those are correlated? I know you read it, but
yeah,
again, I'm slow.
Well, first of all, the cherubim, I've anglicized it because that CH really it should be read as a K. Okay, like an X or whatever, or a hard K, not a soft. And so it's the same. So you have the same, probably the same trilateral, Anyway, you have the same three root letters, KRB. And usually in Semitic language, if you have that, it's the same verbal form or a same noun form. This comes from a verbal root, to pray or bless. And so not everybody accepts this, by the way, but those who don't accept it, I really don't think they have a good alternative to it. But I think the best argument is that we have the same being. They seem to be doing the same type of stuff too. And so I think it makes it pretty rock solid that we have an etymological similarity between the two words, and we have a functional similarity. And the fact that the word probably means prayer or worshiper, you could see why it could have a heavenly and also an earthly context. Obviously, the cherubim that are described in the Bible only have a heavenly context. And maybe because of that, human beings are not called with that word. I don't know. That's just I was just sort of thinking out loud there. It won't happen again until the next time. So now to go back to chapter 3, who are these guys? I don't know, but I'm going to take a wild guess that if you and I were hanging out there, we probably would have been scared out of our wits. And so if we were kicked out of the garden and there are cherubim guarding the gate, we're probably thinking, let's go see what we can find anywhere else but there.
Yeah.
This is really disappointing, but those guys look pretty intimidating. And I think that if you think about it, all the superheroes and all the creatures that have been made, in TV series and all that probably would pale in significance to this. And I still think about it, think of poor little Mary in the New Testament, just minding her own business. An angel comes and she was pretty concerned about it. If that was one of what later tradition calls an archangel, the one who's usually in God's presence, I would imagine that would be about the most frightening thing you could imagine. And so whatever these cherubim are, they are clearly heavenly beings. You might want to call them angelic creatures. I do like Mike Kaiser's book on angels. It's a nice little book. I didn't bring it with me today, but he makes a very good argument that angelic creatures are extremely diverse, and you can lump them all together as angels, but it's almost a meaningless term. And so what are these? They're heavenly creatures that guard holiness. They guard the presence of the deity. And since the deity is evidently still residing in Eden, whatever that means, we have no access to it. Now, I know what you're going to ask. What happened to it? Where was it? Classified. Not only is it classified, it's almost irrelevant. If God has his dwelling there, I don't know. I suppose I can say this in a very vernacular way. He decided to, pack up and go away from this place because now, you think about it, what is Earth now? It's an internment camp, and it's walled off from the rest of the of God's creation for whatever reason, and we no longer have God's. I don't want to get theological here, but we no longer have God's immediate presence in this environment, at least not in the same way as before. I mean, God is everywhere. I suppose you could say that, but God evidently is withholding certain qualities that he has now, in the same way that, if God is everywhere, is he in hell? Well, no, but God has withheld certain qualities from hell, perhaps mercy and kindness and all these things. I don't know what's going on here. And so what happens to Eden? The writer is not it's not a question that they're going to try to answer. I don't know, if I was a little kid reading this and thinking, well, where did Eden go? Or can we go there? I mean, are the cherubim still there? And I guess the answer is yes, they are, but Eden's not where, we can't find it any longer. It's now God's heavenly court, which is now in the heavenly realm, and there is going to be a conjunction of the heavenly and the earthly realm at some point. That's the book of Revelation. Okay. Again, that's too much theology. My head's starting to hurt.
No, that's what interests me. That's why you see me perk up there. But talk about
you said also. You haven't said that before. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
22, the end of it. So this is God kicking them out and the reason being, we can't let them reach out, eat of the tree of life, and let them live forever.
Yes, because remember, they just got their penalty, and what's their penalty? It's death. Okay, and so if their penalty is death, now they cannot circumvent that by eating of the tree of life. I don't know how that works.
So then my question for you would be, because which I guess that now you're kind of a little bit getting into the topic of hell, and which is a fun one. But had they eaten, so if the reward, and they have to eat of this tree to live forever, now they're not allowed to live forever, then again, we go back to the question of what's death and what's life. Is it just the fact of them not being able to be in the presence of the Lord? Is it, if it's a physical tree, in the same way that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a real tree, well, then now they don't live forever. So then the question is, okay, well then what about the afterlife? Is it forever, or is death death? In this context, or to the Mesopotamians?
I think actually in both. In many respects, you when you look at the patriarchs, I don't think they understand things yet. And so if you're a Mesopotamian, what's death? It means that you are now in a different type of existence. It's amorphous, it's dark, you're much more restricted, but it's not non-existence. Okay? And I think in Israel it's the same thing. When I die, it's not like I have no existence. I'm now gone into another realm which is wholly unacceptable. Okay? And that's the underworld. Okay? Nobody wants to go to the underworld. That's, and this is ancient Greece also. This is really a Mediterranean concept in many respects, and maybe, pushing even further east. But, and so I don't think they're, again, I'm thinking this off the top of my head. Again, is there a concept of non-existence? I suppose non-existence would be if you die and you're left to rot, in the desert, and at some point every part of your body has been, rotted away, including your bones. At that point, that's really bad. That might be non-existence, and we don't even want to discuss that. That's too frightening to think of. And so at this point, this would be death. And of course, what's there in the book of Revelation at the end? We're going to have eternal life, and so. You just have to flip a few about 79 hours later in terms of reading, and you're going to find out that we're going to have access to this at some point, just not now. And a few things have to happen in between, like God has to decide to subject himself to the utter humiliation of death on a cross. Well, you probably know the rest. So. So the point is that think of it, for us to be restored back to God, unspeakable horror has to happen. It's so unspeakable that God himself is the only one who can accept it, except that like has to die for like. That must be a rule. And so what does God have to do? He has to become human, take on a human nature permanently. And of course, here's the Christian theology. When God became a man, was he still God? Did he have one nature that was God-man, or was it two natures? Well, the church decided it was two natures. I think rightfully so, but of course nobody asked me, thankfully.
Yeah, because this is where you get into that debate of immortality. And I know you brought up the Greeks, because are the Mesopotamians of the mindset of this immortality? You're going to spend your life somewhere forever. And I know you kind of just answered it, because that's the big argument especially when you get to Revelation, when you get to hell, in any debates, whether or not you think there should be one, the debate on the duration of hell is, well, it wasn't until the Greeks that we just assume we all have immortality. And then a lot of times this verse is kind of reached back to of, well, no, the penalty is death, and the reward would have been eternal life.
Right. And yes, and Mesopotamia, you go to the underworld and there really isn't any description of what happens next. It's like, that's it. Now you're going to be, and so for the most explicit example is when the first king of the Ur dynasty, Ur-Nama, he evidently, we're assuming because of the poem, he must have died in battle unexpectedly. And so they have a poem about him going to the underworld. And by the way, if I'm a king up here, I'm a king down there, except who'd want to be a king in the underworld? And he's a king down there. So and all of a sudden he remembers, like, wait a minute, how did I get here? What's happening on the earth? Oh, they're moaning for me. Oh, this is terrible. Can I get back up there? No. And so in the goddess Ishtar, she descends to the underworld, and she has to go through a lot of mental gymnastics to get back. And, even in Greek literature, if you get to the underworld, the chances of you ever getting back to the regular world are about, 1 in, infinity, but of course they talk about 1 or 2 stories about, Odysseus plays dice and he gets, back up, but it's
Disney's Hercules.
Yeah. But normally that's, most of us aren't going to have that chance. And so the whole point is that story is because it's impossible. So this is an unusual story. So, but I'm sure an Israelite or a freshly minted monotheist is going to be reading this and saying, yeah, remember Joseph wants to make sure his bones go with him because that's my consciousness, but of course there are hints in the Bible, even David, when he's talking about, that he's hoping in the afterlife. You could certainly, it's been traditionally assumed that Job is talking about that in Job 19, that he'll see his Redeemer. I'm not convinced, although Handel was, that he knew that his Redeemer liveth and he would see him at the last. But I'm not convinced that is talking about the last times, the resurrection. But it certainly has that possibility. How long is it for? In Hebrew, they do not have a term for endless time. The word olam means a really, really long time. It's like, God is, El Olam, the one who has existed for a long time. Now, of course, we can look back on it and say, well, we have a word for that. It's called eternity. So how long is hell? Well, I guess in Hebrew it would be olam, really, really long. Is there an end to it? The answer is don't ask. But I would never want to be dogmatic or act as if I knew the end date or if there was one or not. It's probably not the best thing to be asking. That you could ask the same thing about heaven too, I suppose. Is there an end date to this? In the Hebrew Bible, we say, no, it's a really long time, endless, olam. But, all right, that's it. I don't want to
No, that's good. I mean, I'm like the little kid though, right? Like, don't touch the red button. Don't ask the question. And it's like, man, I really want to ask the question, but just for the sake of asking it, because I know that the answer, especially if I bring you a question, I know that there's no satisfaction at the end of the question. It's going to just leave me with more questions.
You just want to be insufferable to me, so you see me sweat.
So then my theological question, since we're talking about my insufferability, would be, yes, the consequence is death. They're told to not, they can't, we have to protect this now. We have to kick them out because we can't let them live forever. You've heard like theologically or within like evangelical church, well, that's because if they eat of it, then they're going to eat and live forever in their fallen state. Is there any kind of, you know what I mean? Like a little bit like, well, that's why. And then because this whole thing from Genesis to Revelation is getting us back to paradise, the new heavens, the new earth, the new Eden, for us to live forever again, face to face in the presence of God himself. And so it, like in Mesopotamia, are they getting any bit of that, or that's...
No, they really don't. That is not an idea that is expanded upon. And so even here, you think about it. So what's the deal? Do they eat it? And then are they now in an eternally damned state because of that? I mean, I don't know. This also might be a teleology to explain why, part of it is like, so this is, if you're looking for Eden, this is why it's not, you're not going to find it. And if you're wondering about, eternal life, this is why it's inaccessible right now. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is God in his deliberative state, and it's really cool that the writer is letting us in on it at that point. I know that, and I understand this, that we want to fill in every theological vacuum that there is. We can't stand a theological vacuum, so we must fill it in with information or interpretation or commentary. And I used to be that way, and now I'm not. I'm in the sense that I don't know exactly what that means, and I'm quite happy in my ignorance, especially from a theological standpoint. I don't know what this means. I don't know, in other words, what would happen if they would have eaten it at this point? I don't know. But
right, because then that would almost go back a little bit on what we talked about in past episodes of, like, yes, the physicality of the death and the life forever, but also like the end times and just the eternal glory state of, well, it's death also to not be in the presence of God, to be banished from him. So then what? Like, then I could have had eternal life without the presence of God if I ate this and God still took up Eden, and we'll ignore all. But that, you know what I mean? That's where I start to go. And again, it's because I'm simple and slow, I guess. So
no, you're just thinking and thinking. I mean, maybe if you've never read Thomas Aquinas, maybe especially if you needed a cure for insomnia, take some Aquinas and find out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and other things. And so he's the guy who asked all the questions that you didn't even know they were questions, and then proceeded to explain why there really isn't an answer to them. And so now, by the way, I think it's fun and healthy to deliberate about stuff like this as long as we don't actually think we're going to come to a resolution to them,
So then the two trees is essentially where we're kind of ending. Is there symbolism in that? Mainly from Mesopotamian context, well, like in their stories?
Yes.
There this dynamic between these two different trees?
No, but like I said briefly before when we talked about the trees, is that we have in iconographic depictions, we have a tree that seems to be hanging out, especially with Assyrian kings and others, but it's not explained in the extant literature, and so we do not know what the connection is. Although it's pretty cool. Think about it. A lot of the times the iconography for the kingdom and other places in the Bible, it's an olive tree. Why? Because an olive tree lasts a really, really long time. And so that shows continuity with the past. Here, I don't know. I don't really think I have anything else intelligent before or after to say about these two trees, other than the fact that there appears to be some significance in Mesopotamia that I can't.
The context for it.
I talked about Parpola's article, which he started there, but he went off in a lot of different directions that have not been accepted by the mainstream of scholarship. So, and of course, they show up in the end, in the garden at the end. So the writer of Revelation, I'm going to take a wild guess, he must have read Genesis.
That's good. And so then my next question would be, would you just be reaffirming what we've talked about in previous episodes in terms of the phrase, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil, that it's not necessarily like, oh, wow, that's brand new, but it's more of that usurping authority of like, I guess my layman's perspective and way to describe it is there's like knowing, and then there's like, no, I know that I know. And it's like knowing good and evil in terms of being able to have autonomy, which is the word that we've been using. Like, well, now it's not like I ethereally, like, okay, well, they knew right from wrong in a sense of, I know I'm not supposed to do this. So they know theoretically right from wrong. But now it's almost like it's kind of like before I was saved, I heard of Jesus. I've heard the God. I know. But then once I've tasted and seen, and I'm born again. Well, no, now I know the Lord. I know that I know. And so is it kind of that?
Yes, it's the experience. The biblical word for knowledge is it's both, but it's emphasizing that if you have it, the intellect, but you have not experienced it, then you don't truly know it. The Greeks were able to divide those things up, and so they understand that you could have an intellectual of understanding without experiencing it. And so here, clearly, this is having the experience of moral of knowing good and evil, which means that you've actually done something, you've participated in it at some level. And of course, the participation is understanding that you are now your own moral agent. At least that was my argument from one or two episodes ago. And so here, I think it's reiterating that. And that's what it's interesting. That would mean that if this is God's counsel here, they are also moral agents. But theologically, I don't think there's a problem with that. Is that angelic creatures, like humans, have had the ability to make their own moral determinations, and according to, of course, church tradition, some angels chose to make their own moral determination outside of God's purview, and they got in trouble for it. And then we presume, although we're never really told this, their ringleader, of course, is the serpent, which is called the devil in Revelation. The shiny thing. That guy.
Well, there you go. Then I guess my random one, which, hey, welcome to Keegan's ADD, which was a while ago, but because you're talking about the things, my brain, I hear caribou. I know it's not caribou. What's it called?
Caribou.
Well, it's like just a different caribou. The caribou.
Accent, yeah. Accent,
the caribou and the cherubim. Throughout Genesis, when we're looking at it, we're looking at the 7 days of creation. We're seeing the symbolism between the two trees. We're seeing that these other civilizations have caribou versus cherubim and all of these different things. And we've even gotten some feedback of, well, it just seems like the Bible's just another one in this line of texts, literary and symbolic images. Whether or not they're all the same. So the Bible's stealing from other places. We've talked about the definitive difference. But before I go into you defending why it's so totally different, the way I think about it is, I know that there's more options, but two options. And I kind of chalk it up to the chicken and the egg. Are these other people onto it because it's just factual knowledge? Everybody's got an epic of the flood. Well, is it because maybe a real flood happened, they just got some of the facts wrong? Or does God choose to, I guess three options, or do they literally put it in a context that would have been understood to them? Or God, knowing that they see the world and this is their viewpoint, does God kind of meet them where they're at to flex and say, no, I'm Yahweh, but then do it to almost as like an apologetic against all these other people? Well, like, okay, they think this stuff, so then God, which I get, it breaks down, okay? So I know it's not like a perfect analogy, but in a way of like, Jesus could have done any miracle. Well, there's significance to him walking on water. Well, he could have flown. He could have zapped a lightning bolt through his finger. It's like, well, why? It's God choosing to come into our context and be like, okay, there's underworld like feelings and thoughts and context to it. So by him walking over the water, he's not just doing a cool parlor, like he's not just doing a cool trick. He didn't Superman fly. Like he's making a theological statement.
Absolutely.
Is there in the sense of like Genesis and stuff, like is it the chicken or the egg? Do you know what I mean? And I know there's no answer, but like, does that make any sense?
Yes, and so let me try to respond, because I'm probably going to say things I've already said before, but the more I've studied this, the more I would be suspicious if Israel was nothing at all like the other cultures, because, of course God met them where they were at. Where else is he going to meet them? I'm God up here. I'm way up here. Now it's going to take you, 3 or 4 millennia before you understand me, but I'm going to throw this out at you anyway. Well, the religion wouldn't have survived. I mean, they would have said, well, this is nothing. We don't understand it. Why would we? We're not drawn to this. And so what would God have done if it was 2025? Something extremely different. How would he meet us where we are? Now, how does the Bible meet us? This is why maybe the Psalms are, in many respects, the Psalms might be the most relevant books for determining our understanding a relationship with God, because here are people who had the same feelings that we have. We can read any psalm and say, that's just how I feel. Wow, I can connect with David. He felt this way and that way. Well, I felt that way and this way. Whereas other parts might be sort of remote and they're doing all sorts of strange cultural items that we don't understand. We can connect with the Psalms perhaps the best, but that's the whole point of this thing, is to show that, of course, is God meeting them in their own cultural context. This is their cultural context. Israel is part of a much larger cultural continuum, and so their language is similar, their architecture is similar. I mean, their mannerisms are similar, their clothing were similar. In fact, I might have already said it before, but if you were walking down the road somewhere in Canaan and there's a bunch of people groups walking by and you're asked to pick out the Israelites, I'm going to say you're going to have a hard time, buddy. Ask them to talk. No, that might not work. They're not going to stick out. They're going to stick out for their understanding of how God, the nature of God, and the meaning behind all of the cultural paraphernalia, not the paraphernalia itself. And so again, the more I read this, the more I would feel suspicious if it was unlike its cultural environment. But I'm going to keep on saying it. It's ultimately superficial. That'd be like you and I, let's just say you worship goo, and I'm a Christian. Next time we can switch, and we're talking and we're engaging, and you ask somebody, all right, so now somebody figure out which one of us worships goo just by looking at us. Well, Keegan just converted to Christianity, but he looks the same. Maybe you might have a glow, but what I'm saying is that he's just the same guy. He still cuts his beard the same way, and wears that dad gang hat, and he still likes the wrong sports teams, and what I'm saying is that what's changed about you, the externals are going to look a lot alike, and so an Israelite it's not that different. This is a shock to the system, and I think this is the pushback that I get, is that, wait a minute, this isn't how we were trained. Well, of course, we weren't trained this way because for 2,000 years, we had been disassociated from the ancient Near Eastern world. It was restored to us beginning in the mid-19th century. So now we're learning about all these things, and we're finding out that Israel was, and the Bible actually existed in a real live context. And it was a shock to the system in the 1850s in the Victorian world, and it's still, in many respects, a shock to the system, 170 years later. And especially for people who are not, intimately aware of it. And so my job is to make it available to you, but also in a way that will not hamper people's faith. Because I'm very sensitive to that also. It's like, wait a minute, just because I learned that the Hammurabi Code, which we will be talking about later, is, a half a millennium older than the earliest date for Moses, I shouldn't have to freak out about that. Somebody on a comment wrote, I used to be a Christian, then I got reason and logic, and then when I found out that the Israelites just copied Sumerian and Egyptian and Greek myths. You missed the whole point. Look at, that's not, we can get over that and not be intimidated by it.
So what's your defense to that? To people that say, well, Genesis is just like all the other accounts and it looks the same.
I guess it's everything I just said, but to summarize it, it's like, and what would you expect it to be? It's kind of like when somebody asked von Wittgenstein, the philosopher, wasn't it silly that the medieval people thought that the earth was the center of the universe? And Wittgenstein said something to the order of, so if you go outside and you look outside and you look up, does it look like we're the center of the universe? It looks just like that. And so, really, what would you have expected the environment to look like? Did you think that the Bible was written by God and then handed down in a sealed envelope from heaven? Some people might think that, and maybe, and of course at some point God does speak, but to the prophets, but he still speaks in a language that they understand, and provides them with something that they would understand their own environment in the same way that if God speaks to me today, either through my heart or anywhere else, he's going to do it in a way that I would understand it. And the fact that we are now, 2, 3, 4,000 years removed from all this stuff, that's not God's fault. That's the human agency. And so here we are trying to reconstruct something that had been written millennia ago, but we're missing a lot of the puzzle pieces. And so my goal I've devoted my adult life to is to try to put some of those puzzle pieces together just so I can look at this and help and illuminate it. This is one way of looking at it. It's not the only way. That's why I'm not dogmatic. This is my best shot. This is what I think this passage means. It doesn't mean you can't look at it from a wholly theological perspective. This is why I would never argue and say, the Trinity is never talked about, in chapter 1 of Genesis. My response is, no Israelite living in the time would have looked at it that way, and that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying there's no Trinity.
Right. Well, it's also, we joked about it. It's like, well, the Trinity would be there. The Father wasn't like, hey, Son, Holy Spirit, y'all hang out in your rooms. I'm just going to meet with, it would have been.
Yeah, don't ask me how that works.
Yeah.
Or any other human.
Right. Well, and we also don't like both and, right? Like again, the Trinity thing can ruffle feathers, but it's, we take it a little bit too far in my mind, whether or not it's the divine council, God, who is Trinitarian, all together with his council or not. It's like, okay, we also know there's angelic and heavenly beings right now with God. It's basically like, okay, is it saying, is it a big party or just God? It's like,
were they asked out of the room too?
It's like it's just interesting to look at, but again, you're looking through the lens of how they would have understood it, and I think it's valuable for people, and it's been valuable for me. Again, not that you have to go into crazy weeds, But the reality of anytime we're looking at anything, specifically Old Testament, just because it's so much more removed from us and just harder for people like me and normal people to understand, just because it's a way different civilization as opposed to the New Testament. And so I just think the importance of it is this phrase of the Bible can never mean today what it never meant back then. It doesn't mean it can't like elaborate and build on itself, right? Okay, they understood it as divine counsel. Okay, but it was prophetic in a way. And so, no, it's actually Trinitarian, and now we have the full canon of Scripture. And so it's like, okay, well, now we can, let's say that it is Trinity, just for the sake of my argument. Like, okay, well, now we have purview to it, and now we can understand, okay, yeah, it was like not understood that way, but now the fuller context. But as a whole, like when you're looking at stuff, like if we're going to get on some topics like the Nephilim, it can't mean what it never meant. Like when it's a specific term and not ambiguous, and Genesis, again, being a little bit of poetry and quoting God and stuff. So like that one, it's not a one-for-one correlation, but it's just important to understand how they would have understood it, and it's going to help us apply it and for it to become life to us, that being the Bible.
That's a great way to summarize it. I think that's perfect. You think of, just to finish up, you think of Isaiah 7, which of course is a prophetic passage, but in the context of Isaiah 7, here's a Judean king who's getting castigated for doing something, and in the context of him in the Assyrian Empire, well, you never would have guessed how it's going to be interpreted in a spiritual and a cosmic way 700 years later. You never would have guessed that. And so, in other words, it had to have a meaning for the original audience. If it didn't have a meaning for them, what use would it have been? So, can it have a double meaning? Can it have that concrete meaning right there and another spiritual meaning later on? Well, that's the whole point.
Well, and that's seen throughout the Bible. It's the right now and not yet. Read the book of Revelation. Yeah, like that's all over the place there. And then my last question, which goes with that really well, is Adam and Eve. Are they real and archetypal, or do you see them just as like, from your vantage point, do you see them as real people, the only two from all mankind comes, or are they just archetypal? Or, like some people have the perspective of, well, no, Adam and Eve are real people, but they also serve as this archetypal role for humanity itself. I don't see any reason why they can't be real people and archetypal. And are they the only ones? The Bible doesn't say anything about that, so I'm going to avoid that question. I know that that's the traditional view, of course, is that everyone came from Adam and Eve, and perhaps they did. In other words, there's no hint that there's anybody else around. On the other hand, of course, the big question is, well, they had two boys. What else? How did they start intermarrying? And my answer is, we're only being given, this is a historical prologue to a treaty, and so we're not exactly getting all the details. And so obviously there were more people at some point. When Cain goes off and he's afraid that people will harm him, where they come from? Are they the Neanderthals? Or I mean, it's fun to ask as long as you don't take yourself too seriously. So yes, they're real, and Genesis is writing narrative at this point about the humans, in the same way it's writing narrative later on about patriarchs, and so you'd be hard pressed to say that the writer thinks they're in a different category. But is there more going on? Yeah, there's a whole lot more going on. We're told what we need to know for understanding how we can get back to a relationship with God. Awesome. Yeah. Well, there you go. We just wrapped up Genesis 3, and this is gonna be the wrap up for our little series that we're doing. Genesis 1, 2, and 3, kind of just the creation account, rethinking Genesis from the creation story. and we're going to be moving on. We're going to probably be moving on to Genesis 6. And so we would love to do a wrap-up episode. We'll probably release it out of order because we want your guys' questions. So this is my plea to you. If you have been following this little Genesis series, if you have questions of your own, if you're like, my goodness, Keegan, I can't believe you didn't think of that question, please message us. You can email. All that stuff's going to be attached below, and we will do a wrap-up episode on Rethinking Genesis with your guys' questions. So follow the link below, and if you haven't already, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the Buried Bible Podcast.